Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to IIM Bangalore's Vista 2020. For this session, we have with us today Professor Acharya. Professor Acharya is the CV Star Professor of Economics in the Department of Finance at New York University Stern School of Business and an academic advisor to the Federal Reserve Banks of New York and Philadelphia. Sir was a Deputy Governor at the Reserve Bank of India during Jan 2017 to July 2019, in charge of monetary policy, financial markets, financial stability, and research. Speeches while at the RBI were released in July 2020 in the form of a book titled Quest for Restoring Financial Stability in India, published by Sage Publications, with a new introductory chapter, Fiscal Dominance, a Theory of Everything in India. A warm welcome to you, sir. We also have with us Mr. Vinay Tewari. The session is going to be moderated by Mr. Vinay Tewari. He is the managing editor of India's leading English news channel, Mirror Now. In his role, he leads the editorial mandate for the channel, content strategy, and closely works with the channel's business and leadership teams to drive the channel's growth agenda. An industry veteran with an extensive journalistic and editorial experience, he is a newsroom pioneer with over 25 years of experience in broadcast and print media. In his previous stint as the managing editor of India Today Television, he was responsible for rebranding, restructuring, and relaunching the channel. He has also been associated with the IBM Network in the capacity of a managing editor for CNN IBM, IBM 7, and IBM Lokmat, where he was responsible for launching the English and Marathi news channels. Aside of 9 years in print media at the Times of India, he has also worked in the Hindi news genre while leading key operational teams at Aaj Tak. I, on behalf of Forum for Industrial Interaction, the Business Club of IIM Bangalore, welcome each and every one of you to ITW Presents Vista 2020, powered exclusively by Mirror Now, our news channel partner. Thank you very much, sir. And now, without any other delay, I would like to hand over the stage to both of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Siddharth.
Thank you. Looking forward to it.
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Acharya, for being a part of this. It's absolutely a pleasure and honor for all of us. I think everybody who's listening into this and watching you, and of course I can see a lot of people are still in the waiting room. They would, by the end of the hour, will come out very rich and much, I would say, happier having heard you, because there is, I mean, at least we in our profession seem to sense that there is a growing, shrinking space of people who actually make sense anymore. So it's always a pleasure to speak to you.
Yeah, my joke on this is that it's good to bring some sense to the sense section.
Absolutely, absolutely. For all of you, I'm sure most of you really need no introduction at all. But I think some of the people who are watching this who are not aware, you're a Mumbai boy, and like any good Mumbai boys, your love for cricket and your love for films is always going to be there.
Also Pav Bhaji, you should have.
And also Pav Bhaji. The reason I mentioned cricket is, the IPL is on. I don't know, Dr. Acharya, if you're able to watch a little bit of that in New York or not, but it's on. It's almost reaching.
Yeah. No, the timing gets sort of very difficult.
Absolutely.
So I catch up with the scores and highlights afterwards. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
The reason I started off with the cricket analogy is because, I was once reading something that you had said, and you had used a very interesting cricket analogy. When someone asked you a question about demonetization, you said it's a googly outside the off stump, and you deflected answering that. So let me start by asking a cricketing analogy question. Lockdown in India got lifted about, say, the beginning of the lockdown was about 5 months ago. The last 5 months or so, we've seen virtually now a complete lift down. Just about a couple of things still left to be lifted fully, but more or less, most of the activities are back in track. Now, going from here, do you see the pitch wearing down further, the ball turning a little more dangerously, or do you think batting is going to become easier? Or do you see signs of the pitch, the economy pitch, actually becoming a little better as we go along? Is it going to be tougher to bat on, or is it going to be more difficult to bat on as we head into a very critical next 6 months phase, Dr. Acharya?
Yes. I think COVID in general is a fairly treacherous wicket in general. And I would say we have to pay some attention and attach some weight to what's happening in other parts of the world also. Many parts of the world seem to have had the peaks of their infection curves, some in April, some in June, some a little bit later. But whether you call it second waves or third waves, as the containment or mitigation policies have been relaxed, the infections have actually started rising quite substantially. As you know, several European countries have announced a month-long shutdown again sometime this week. The United States numbers are actually it's close to their highest numbers. In fact, one day this week, the numbers actually scaled a new high. The deaths continue to be high in these countries. Of course, there are contrasts in some patterns with India. Our curve seems to have peaked about 5 to 6 weeks back. The decline has been fairly dramatic, actually, and I'm trying very hard to speak to people who understand the numbers better as to what explains the very sharp decline. Is it an actual decline in the numbers? Is it that the testing rate was increasing earlier but now has flattened out and so the numbers aren't going up? Or is it that the spread isn't there in the rural areas? Now, we all know that the reported cases in India are smaller than the actual number of cases, perhaps by a factor of, 30 to 50 in that range. So one theory that is out there is that we might have actually reached herd immunity in our urban centers and hotspots. Nevertheless, the evidence in Delhi over the last week again gives you a pause. What's happening there? We thought Delhi would have reached herd immunity, but the numbers are rising there again. And what is worrying me the most is that in Europe now, the medical research seems to be suggesting that this new wave that has started seems to be a mutation of the virus that's slightly different than the previous strain. So I think all of these are uncertainties. I think we are still in a fog of uncertainty. I think if our numbers continue declining at the pace and steadily the way they are, I think the economy should actually get a gradual rebound. But I would mention two factors here that to me are the most crucial, which is that, see, what COVID has highlighted is how interdependent each economy is within itself. Like how interdependent are the jobs for the unskilled on what is the health well-being of those who can afford to create jobs for the unskilled. And similarly, it is helping us understand how interdependent various economies are. That suppose you just have one economy that is isolated from COVID and the rest of the world is infected, there are limits to how far this infected economy can grow, or the uninfected economy can grow. So I think regardless of whichever way to see it, I think there are going to be headwinds to growth. Growth is not going to be easy to come by, either domestically, because certain sectors like airlines, travel, hospitality, certain types of services are going to be affected because people have shifted their habits over to e-commerce, digital over the last 6 months. Some of these will stick around. They are not going to fundamentally just revert back to contact-based means of trade and exchange the way we used to do it in the pre-COVID phase. And second, I think, if the global growth isn't there, we can't really rely on exports being that powerful an engine of growth. And that means that growth will have to come from somewhere else. And so I think these are the kinds of questions we have to ponder over. So there is both a sectoral reallocation of growth that's going to take place and the overall composition of where growth can come from in India. I think both of these need to be kept in mind. But overall, it's a treacherous wicket, and we have to think, in my view, fundamentally about structural transformational reforms as being the way out, because I think COVID is both a crisis, but it is also a golden opportunity to be honest with ourselves about the long overdue corrections that are needed in the Indian economy and the financial sector.
Right, and I'm glad you said that, Dr. Acharya, because it leads in very neatly into my next question, where, I've heard you say multiple times that, politics and economics is pretty nicely aligned to undertake substantial reforms, and including disinvestments. And I think in the last 4 or 5 months, one of the arguments and one of the criticisms that have happened by several economists in Indian government's technique or the method they've used is that they've only addressed the demand side, supply side, and they haven't exactly addressed the supply side. And the real problem seems to be the lack of cash in hand that a lot of Indians currently have. Obviously, one of the arguments that the government used to give us was that, well, they have a fiscal issue to manage, and there is also, there is a problem that they have. There's no denying that there is a problem. Now, one of the solutions that you've been arguing about, and a lot of economists have been arguing about, is the need for us to disinvest, and the government doesn't seem to be doing it as much as they need to. My question to you is that while you say that politics and economics is very neatly aligned to actually undertake disinvestments, don't you get this feeling, or is it fair to give a very contradictory opinion on that and say that in India, economics or economic decisions tend to follow too much of a political compulsion or a political fallout by the governments, and they take decisions, very critical decisions in the economy, keeping the political fallout in mind, and that in the long run ends up harming more than helping. So in fact, I would argue the opposite, that it's not really aligned. It's actually going the opposite direction, because the governments are so worried about electoral outcomes, including in the states, which happen every year, that they don't seem to be thinking about economics. They really only think about politics.
Yeah, see, at a broad level, I'm with you. This is the reason why the preface chapter in my recently released book was titled Fiscal Dominance, a theory of everything in India. When I look at the financial sector policy making, I thought that the only overarching principle which kind of was driving everything that I could arrive with was that we are basically serving the political masters in one way or the other. The rules of the game are constantly getting changed so that the government can continue its borrowings at a low cost or keep them down in the short run. The second point I also tend to agree with you is that these were also the big obstacles we faced in securing financial stability during my term for like the next decade or two, so that, we could have sustainable growth. We didn't have to keep asking questions about our banks all the time. Every 2 years, we are again asking the same question of how much NPA can the banks withstand it, etc., etc. Now, having said that, I want to make three sort of shades of this broad point that you have raised. First is that when I mention, especially in the context of divestments, I think when we refer to politics, we have to think about politics as not just politics, but also the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy actually plays a very big role in being a stumbling block to getting stakes disinvested. Why? Because every ministry, every public sector enterprise that is out there is basically a turf for whoever the minister is, whatever is the bureaucracy in charge of that. Now, these public sector enterprises are the main turf they have. They can control them, they can design their policies. That is what gives them power. That is what, in a way, makes them important to the rest of the government machinery. For a bureaucrat and that respective minister to come along and say, listen, we are going to cede control. I want to give up my powers. I want to do what is the right thing for the country in the long run. It takes a lot of magnanimity. It takes a lot of, I would say, alignment with national interests rather than one's own parochial interests. I think it requires a great deal of courage of conviction to deviate from what is the norm in the bureaucracy. So I think, one, I want to say that it is not just a matter of political will. The political will also has to be there to bring the bureaucracy along to making these things happen. The second thing I would stress here is that we are already seeing signs, though, that some reforms are being embraced. The farm bills, whatever the content is, it has been there for a while. People have been asking about deregulating these markets, getting the wholesalers out of this, getting greater price directly over to the end farmer. Now, I don't want to comment on, how the process went about for its implementation, because I don't understand it and I don't have the details, but the economic content of the farm bill makes sense. And the fact that it has been embraced is a good sign. The same way the labor laws, we can do a lot more, but already there is some progress in what we are seeing on the labor laws as well. I think the key aspect that remains here is divestments, as you said, and I would also say infrastructure spending. I think this is where I think we need more and not much is happening. So I would say the fact that politics and economics are aligning, we are seeing some positive signs over there. And the third point I would add here is this critical point on politics and economics aligning when the fiscal situation gets tight. And let me explain what I mean by this, that see, when the fiscal situation is not so tight, it's possible for the government to not divest, keep borrowing more, keep pressurizing the financial sector regulators to keep interest rates low, pump a lot of liquidity into the economy by buying government bonds, get financial firms to buy government bonds so that the government yields stay low. Now, all of this is just repression of the economy. You are basically trying to ensure that government's borrowings remain cheap, and this is happening at the expense of inflation. It is happening at the expense of money going to other private borrowers in the economy and so on. At some point that adds up and growth comes down. Now, once growth comes down, the tax revenues for the government come down. And then the fiscal now begins to on the one hand, debts are rising and the taxes start coming down. Now, once that happens, then the government suddenly realized that, oh, maybe we have taken this a bit too far. Now we need also the revenues to grow. And maybe the way out is for me to actually reduce my borrowings. And I think a golden principle for reducing the borrowings for the Indian government should not be necessary to cut back on what is needed to be done now, which is the relief and repair in the midst of COVID, but to use this investment, sell equity. Don't go and borrow. Sell your equity. And actually these firms will become more profitable rather than being managed by a particular ministry or bureaucracy. They will be under the discipline of the markets. You can find some white knights who actually have technological expertise, financial expertise, managerial expertise. These firms can turn around. And so the revenues would also increase on that front, besides money coming into the government exchequer balance sheet, also through equity raising rather than just debt.
Right, so let me just ask you one follow-up question on this as well, because personally for me, the axis of politics and economics fascinates me, because I think in India especially, this tends to be a much sharper axis than anywhere else. One of the things that happened in the last 15 days here, at least, which became controversial, a lot of talk happened around it, was the decision by a political party to put the promise of a free COVID vaccine as an election campaign promise. Now, there were two things that came out of it. One, of course, that once that promise of nature like this is put in an election manifesto in one state, it triggered a competitive announcements from other states as well, because they also wanted to tell people, oh, we are with you as well. And you saw in the next 1 week or so, almost 5 to 6 states now saying, we'll give the vaccine free to everybody. Now, from a non-economist's point of view, my argument has been that why should everybody get the vaccine free? If I have the ability to pay, why should I become part of the fiscal burden for the government? And remember, Another Poonawala, who heads Serum Institute, and he's already gone public once to say that he estimates that there could be about as much as an 80,000 crore bill. And I would suspect that this is not just capital expense, it's also OPEX and CAPEX, both will be required by the government to actually roll it out over a couple of years or 3 years or so. Would you, number one, agree that a free vaccine for every single Indian is a bad idea, because this competitive politics is a needless financial drain? Those who can afford to pay for it should pay for it. And number two, do you get a sense that the governments have not fully woken up to the aspect of a universal immunization program that includes every single Indian is not as simple as it sounds? I mean, you require cold chains, you require training programs, you require volunteers who will run into thousands, and you of course require a mammoth database which can actually track people. And of course, you need a fiscal allocation for this as well.
Yes. See, given that, there are elections happening around, what I'll do is I'll try and keep my remarks a little bit more general so that it doesn't look like a commentary on anything specific that is going on right now. See, broadly, let me just switch attention to United States just for a brief moment, because I think it illustrates a very crucial point. On the face of it, one of the most powerful nations of the world, one of the richest nations of the world, very high per capita income. And you look at the health outcomes that we have seen. Among the largest number of cases, and excess death rate is among the highest in the United States of all countries of the world. What this shows is that what matters is not how rich or poor a country is, but what is the quality of its health provision at the last mile. A lot of people who are dying in the United States are in the low-income households. They don't have access to healthcare services. They live in poor neighborhoods and townships where there aren't actually enough number of hospital beds or emergency healthcare of high quality. So I think the lesson I'm learning from COVID is that basic primary healthcare and access to it at a community level in a practical manner, that you don't have to drive like a long distance, etc., to get healthcare, that this is a public good that the governments need to provide. I think whether vaccinations, etc., are an overall public good or not, I would think it's a public good, because everyone's uh, infection is potentially a spillover onto everyone else that is out there. Now, clearly, the poorest person can't afford the vaccine, so someone will most likely have to subsidize that expenditure. So whether we call it free for everyone, or whether we say that it is essentially free below a certain income segment, it's very clear to me that ultimately those who can afford it are going to have to pay a little bit extra, either in the form of a tax or in the form of a surplus on the price that is charged to them for vaccines, so that we can give the vaccines at either a low cost or free to those who really can't afford it. That tax transfer has to take place. Because it's a public good. It's not so much that one is taxing the rich and they are worse off with this. No, we are taxing you because we have to make the transfer so that the entire pie of the economy is actually better off on the health front. And I think my sense is this is the way we need to convey the messaging about what needs to be done. What happens, unfortunately, in India is that you do get this competitive race to the bottom in these packages and announcements. I think farm loan bills are actually a classic example of this, where you start off in one state and then gradually that becomes the election ploy in every single state out there. Every state then starts incurring huge losses over the next 2 to 4 years, because the farm loan waivers take a while to extend. But in case of farm loans, it's even worse, because what people don't realize is that it actually vitiates the entire credit culture of making repayments on the farm loans, etc. In contrast, I would say the vaccinations may be a little bit of a one-off expenditure. It is something that's very specific to the COVID. But I broadly agree with the principle that we need to provide universal primary healthcare to everyone at a very low or minimal cost. And that can only happen through a tax transfer from the rich to the poor. There's no other way out of
Right.
that.
One of the things about the Indian situation, the economy, which was particularly difficult, was that for us the crisis actually began much before the COVID pandemic arrived. We were struggling with a lot of issues. The banking is one area which you've spoken about extensively, uh, especially the recapitalization program that the government announced. On paper, when they first made that announcement, there were people who said, okay, there is at least a plan now, there is an intent. But now, about a year later, do you believe that India is almost losing a golden opportunity of banking reforms? Because that doesn't seem to be happening or panning out the way a lot of people believe it would. Do you think we are losing the opportunity, or have we lost the opportunity, or still there is time left for us to actually, look at banking reforms and recapitalization a little more seriously than we had?
Yeah, see, as far as public sector banks are concerned, I'm not seeing too much traction for reforms yet. We keep pushing for it. I pushed very aggressively during my term. We had some success, as I highlight in my preface chapter, for about 10 months. But then there was a little bit of a T20 style approach in 2018 towards the national election coming up. And then, the pressures were to relax all the norms so that public sector banks could once again start lending wherever they could, to show that there was growth and credit pickup and all this in the economy. Okay, so let's say that's water under the bridge. Things are over. Have we done anything decisive since then? Some reforms are taking place, but I think the elephant in the room is the ownership of these banks, their governance, and the role that they are playing in the national financial system. And I think over a period of time, when you look at these banks, you have to reach at least three simple conclusions. First, they are a huge cost to the taxpayer. Just in the last 12 years, we have injected 4 lakh crores of recapitalization money. The opportunity cost of that money, because public sector banks have been losing market value, whereas you could have invested this money in an index or a private sector firm, etc. So if you calculate some reasonable opportunity cost, this actually amounts to 7 to 7.5 lakh crores of rupees. Now, this is a non-trivial amount of money. This is $100 billion that could have been available to spend on COVID relief efforts.
Absolutely.
So I think we have to realize that now, whatever you think are the benefits of this edifice, it is now a humongous cost to the taxpayer, and it better be that what they are creating value and for whom is worth at least that much. Ideally, it should be worth even more, but it is worth at least that much.
Right.
Second thing that you realize is that these are actually partly political. It's part of the political toolkit. The reason why the bureaucracy, the ministries and the government don't want to cede control of public sector banks, public sector insurance companies, public sector power finance companies is because you can use these entities to do extend credit, not recognize losses, pump prime the economy in times when growth isn't looking good and you have an electoral cycle compulsion that's coming up. I think you cannot deny this.
Even to make them do disinvestment, which is Peter playing Paul.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. You get them, you get one to buy another, and you keep the debts off balance sheet, and then you pay a dividend to the government. And the third thing that I think what strikes me the most is that every time I propose reforms, it is not actually, I don't get emails from the government saying what a crazy idea. I get emails from citizens of the country saying, what are you saying? You want to privatize these nationalized banks? They are creating so many jobs over the country. Privatization is not going to be a silver bullet. The real problems are this, that, etc. And I think we have not honestly asked the question. We have had 50 years of these experiments now. These banks were nationalized in late 60s and late 70s. So between 40 to 50 years of these experiments. How long are we going to continue with a failed experiment? Their governance is very poor because rather than their boards being empowered and having skin in the decisions that is being made, most of them follow like the same business model that's directed essentially from the Department of Financial Services and the Finance Ministry. The governance is very poor. You are not even finding adequate number of people to put in the MD position, executive director position, and the board members. Second, because of the government ownership stakes, as I explained, it's now bleeding serious taxpayer money that has better alternative use for providing health, education, infrastructure to the society. And third, okay, they are creating jobs, but are these high quality jobs? Is it the best quality job in the country, even within the financial sector, to be employed at a public sector bank? I'm sorry, no. Go and visit a public sector branch. Go and visit a public sector bank's headquarters. I'm not saying they're not doing earnest work, but this is not the best quality job that the financial sector can provide. Last point here, Vinay, is that, the private banks also have their problems. There are governance failures every now and then, but they are more idiosyncratic. And the system has feedback. People who have been involved in the governance failures at private banks, they are out of the system now. Those banks are on the mend. In 5 years, they will be on a path of solid strength and recovery. Many of them that were problematic 5 years back are now already on good shape. We don't have this sort of feedback and discipline mechanism working in the case of public sector banks. So I keep trying to send the message. I think that's the only way out, because partly the politics will respond when people and the citizens of the country want the change to happen. I think the real problem I see is that the middle class in India thinks of public sector enterprises as a way of getting cushy jobs which are secure. They don't have very high pay, but these are cushy, low quality, but secure jobs. And they don't want actually these to be taken away. I think they are kind of, being a little bit of a Sheikh Challi. I think, they are actually cutting off the tree on which they are sitting themselves, because actually if these firms disinvested, they were better governed, they became private, they would actually have better jobs. Yes, the jobs will not be as secure, but the upside of the job, the overall quality of the job would be far, far better. And this would be good for the economy overall.
I've been hearing and reading you for at least now 3 years, if not 4, talk about the need for what you call a bad bank. And you believe that that's possibly one solution that should be done. Maybe an out-of-the-box solution, but it's a solution that possibly needs to be done. Say 3 or 4 years later, do you still believe that we need a bad bank, or do you think the situation has become so bad that pretty much everyone would automatically qualify as a bad bank, and you really can't have one bad bank, you might need many bad banks?
Yeah, so the joke goes that, there are so many bad banks in India. Why do you need another one? So, see, a bad bank is just a place to take out the bad assets and park them. So the key question that arises is, at what price are you going to take out the assets and transfer them to the other balance sheet? Because if that price is too low, then what's going to happen is that the original balance sheet is going to be left with a huge loss to plug the hole. If the price is too high, then the question is, how is the bad bank going to pay for this? So what we need is a good price discovery mechanism. And what we have done, Dr. Raghuram Rajan and I have written a piece called Indian Banks, A Time to Reform. We have tried to sketch out what sort of models have succeeded in other parts of the world. And one of the models that I'm very interested in was employed in South Korea after the Southeast Asian crisis in late 90s, where they basically created a loan sales platform, which originally the government supported. They standardized the loan contracts and digitized them, so you could actually see each contract's details on the internet. And then they ran public auctions so that the prices of these loan sales were becoming visible to the entire ecosystem. That helped create benchmark prices for each sector. That, if it's a steel NPA, roughly you are getting, say, 60 paisa on a rupee. If it's a power or an infra NPA, roughly you are getting, say, 30 or 40 paisa on a rupee. So you will get some sort of benchmarking of the prices, and that transparency can actually elicit interest more from private players, maybe some private equity firms, some global players might actually come in. So I think we have to think a little bit hard about how to develop the infrastructure for transferring the bad loans out of the bank balance sheets onto, quote unquote, those who would manage these distressed assets. You can call them bad banks, you can call them an asset management company, what name we give to it doesn't matter. Just one point here, which is that we do have assets such as power. Like, we have a lot of non-performing assets in the power sector because a lot of excess capacity got created during 2010 to 12, and that we are not yet actually cut. The demand is not yet high to use the entire capacity. Now, you can't really liquidate a power asset. What are you going to do? Means, are you going to take these things out? Yeah, means, that's going to be very costly. The land is the only valuable resource other than the power plant that is out there. So there may be some value to quarantining these assets for a while, like you can call it mothballing, quarantining, whatever you want, until the demand picks up. It's an open question whether a government should actually set up that kind of a bad bank. It could be something that the NTPC runs, for example. It's a relatively better run public sector enterprise. Maybe they could mothball a little bit, but NTPC itself will want to do these transactions at the right price.
That's right.
And therefore, I think getting the right price is crucial, whether it's a government-owned bad bank or whether these are private bad banks that come about from outside.
So, do you think the bankruptcy code has been able to do its job for which it was intended, or do you think it's a bit of a non-starter? Or there were just a couple of headline stories there and nothing beyond that?
No, I think it has handled a very large number of cases. It certainly seems to be an improvement on the, the DRT and the mechanisms we had for sick companies before. So it's certainly an improvement. I think the question is whether it has delivered up to its potential. I think that remains to be evaluated in a few years' time. The evidence seems to be that the original very tight time-bound resolution framework of 180 days with a 90-day grace doesn't seem to have been fully met. I think cases are taking much longer, unfortunately, and I think that's a problem, because the longer a distressed asset sits around, the more the promoter has time to asset strip or siphon off the funds. And more the asset just depreciates in value because it's no longer being maintained as being current or a state of the art in the sector where it is. But the one area where I think it has possibly delivered is that a large number of Indian bankruptcies are for small firms. And I think those are getting resolved relatively quickly now, and they are generating recoveries for the bank balance sheets. I think the key problem in India of bad loans is that of the legacy loans, which are of relatively large accounts. I would say, like 1,000 crores and above, those are the cases where quick resolution would be a very welcome change. Now, of course, right now, the bankruptcy code is in suspension. New cases are not being filed. Personally, I'm of the opinion that they should just get back as the economy reopens. These things should also reopen. And, we can't have banks not having a mechanism to resolve cases in order to get recoveries and get some
Which
recapitalization back.
which actually brings me to the next question. Again, something I just want to touch upon. Like over the last 5 months or so, the government has announced a lot of so-called booster measures to prop up the economy.
Sorry, can you repeat it? What measure?
I'm saying over the last few months or so, the government has been talking about booster doses to prop up the economy, to revive the sentiment. Of course, there have been two views on it. A lot of people believe, that they have addressed the wrong end of the problem. But the fact is that a very cursory look at that, of course, tells you that the biggest focus is, of course, on cushioning loans, which they're providing for the small sector, especially the MSME sector. And a lot of it is just, it's not exactly cash in hand. It's not really improving liquidity. It's really just doing structural changes at the back end. Now, in the last 15 days or maybe 3 weeks or so, they seem to be tinkering around with things like LTC, where, the taxable component is being made tax-free. They've extended to the private sector, hoping the festival sentiment would perhaps use that to their advantage, so on and so forth. Now, do you believe that, the government's decision to actually go for the supply side and not the demand side is going to be a bit of a costly mistake? Or do you think this is the right way, because the measures that they've taken in the long run, or in the medium to long run, would actually end up strengthening a sector which possibly is one of the biggest employers, and hence, of course, the most critical for us to, come back into the game?
It's basically a mixed bag. I would say it's kind of ticked off boxes a little bit on both demand side and supply side, but maybe not been terribly decisive on either side overall. And the fiscal constraints, maybe the size of the borrowing programs, even pre-COVID. And I want to stress this. Let me actually start with that. I think India's main problem in dealing with COVID has been our pre-COVID initial conditions. That, the government balance sheet was very stretched. The growth had already been declining, and the banking sector was not repaired to a point where the central bank had ideally wanted to repair it, at least starting, I would say, 2014-15, and especially with our efforts in 17-18. And, I don't want to get into details, but I sketch out some of these efforts at length in my book, Quest for Restoring Financial Stability. So I think one has to keep this in mind, that when you don't start with the right initial conditions, and when a shock hits you, it's much harder to recover, because you have not created a health condition for yourself in economic health terms that allows you to actually fend off illnesses very, very well. Now, I would make 2 points. I think debt moratoria and maybe a little bit of relief on the NPA classification made sense for 3 to 6 months. I think roughly in coincidence with the lockdown phase of the economy. As you said, now we are in unlock 5 or whatever they call it. And so now it's time to get back to normal. See, if we don't recognize bank losses in time, then what's going to happen is that when the economy is trying to take off again post-COVID, we are still going to be dealing with the legacy loan problems of banks. And this has been our perennial problem. The perennial problem with India is that when the economy is about to take off and private credit demand rises, especially our public sector banks remain very, very weakly capitalized. And because they remain weakly capitalized, they are unwilling to lend to healthier borrowers. They either want to lend to their legacy loans, so they do zombie lending, or they want to do lazy lending, which is to just invest in government bonds. Now, you may ask the question, okay, if public sector banks are not lending, what's the problem? Why can't our private banks, which are in healthier shape, fill in that gap? They can't, because a big pool of deposits is actually with the public sector banking system. And you and I and others, not all, but many of us have greater confidence in the sovereign backing of these public sector banks. So the migration of deposits away from public sector banks to the private system doesn't happen that fast. It's happening, but at a very glacial pace. So in the meantime, what happens is the private banks are able to make huge margins because healthier borrowers in the economy are not being lent to in a competitive manner by the public sector banking system that is out there. So I think we run a real risk that if the debt moratoria and the losses that banks will incur associated with that, if we don't recapitalize those in time, then the banking system will act being a drag on economic growth in the post-COVID recovery phase rather than actually be an accelerating force on that growth. And therefore, the discussion that we had earlier on recapitalization, improving governance, then divesting stakes, perhaps even reprivatizing some of them, is something the government needs to lay out a blueprint for right now, because otherwise we're going to see a repeat of what has happened in the last decade. Now, coming to the demand side, I would say that it's very clear that if you put extra money in the pockets of the relatively less well-off households, their consumption will get the maximum boost right now, because they are really at their essential expenditures. That is all that they can undertake. So if you boost their income, they will do more of these immediate expenditure boost that the economy can see. I would really like for the government to use this opportunity to roll a variety of our merit-based subsidies into a single universal basic income and reduce the whole paraphernalia of subsidies that we have. We have so many enterprises, Food Corporation of India, so many power corporations, etc. Then they have to run their own financing costs. So then we have financing arms for all of these things. Many of them have distortive consequences for the economy, such as the National Small Savings Fund, through which the Food Corporation of India raises a part of its money and so on. So I think we need to simplify the government's expenditure programs, roll all the subsidies into a universal basic income. This will free up money, and we can use that to do some more direct transfers, and we can use the freed up money to do some infrastructure spending that will create more jobs on the ground. And I think this is the kind of demand stimulus that should be considered. So I think on both supply and demand side, I would say we need more, but we also need the right actions. It's not just a question of doing more of what the government has done. It's actually embracing the actions that are the right responses, but have not yet actually found their way into the government toolkit.
So let me ask you another question, slightly different from what we've been talking so far. I mean, one of the worries that some people have and some of the things that we are observing, do you believe that the current stress that a lot of the corporate India is undergoing, especially the smaller sector or possibly even the medium-sized companies that are currently going through, this is slowly but very clearly leading to a larger monopolistic corporate structures that exist in India, which means that the big players, the big daddies are just getting bigger because possibly they have cash in hand or they have cash reserves, which they can use not just to acquire distressed assets, which could be useful for them, but create, just muscle their way in and do what they've been waiting to do for a very long time. And in that medium and long term, this is going to be dangerous for us because this will make the large corporations or the bigger corporations become more monopolistic as it squeezes out the medium, the small ones going forward. Do you see that as a negative? And do you see this worry to be a legitimate one?
Yeah, there are two aspects to this. Let me touch upon both. First, it was already a part of your previous question as well, which is what has been happening for our small and medium-sized enterprises. I think it has been a disaster, if you ask me honestly. See, we have been giving them restructuring packages for their debt relief since 2016. I believe if you go back and check every year, there has been one package. Maybe 1 year there hasn't been, but then in the prior year, there might have been two packages. So our approach to the MSME sector has been one of dole-outs, just like farm loan waivers. Don't address the actual problem of the farmers on the ground, but just keep waiving their debts off. Now, if you have to do this for 5 years in a row, I think the problem cannot be temporary. The problem is a permanent problem. I think certain parts of our MSME segment, take textiles, for example, they have just lost their global competitive edge. They are not able to produce, export at the same costs that even our poorer neighboring countries are able to do. So that must be a problem with the ease of doing business on the ground. The problem might be with the way the labor contracts are. The problem will be with whether there are any incentives in the system for an MSME to become large and formalize and grow to a bigger size when you keep giving these dole-outs on an annual basis. So I think there's a fundamental rethink that is needed on the MSME sector. Now, the second question is a really, really interesting one. And it's actually one where we can get it right or we can get it terribly wrong. McKinsey has an excellent report on how certain emerging markets such as Korea became actually very important powerhouses in terms of economic growth. And what you see is that they created companies that were very large exporting champions of the country. And the smaller firms in the country are then connected to this very large national level champions. And so the growth of the national champion is actually also boosting the small enterprises that are connected to these national champions in the economy. Now, this requires two things to work at the same time. One, that there has to be a pathway for a small company to become a large company. And second, there has to be enough entry of small companies in the economy so that there are also last mile jobs that are getting created. Now, what would be worrisome is if we don't have enough entry of small firms and simultaneously we are just concentrating the sectors into just one company at the top. In fact, a concern I have is really that some of the large companies are looking now the same company across a large number of sectors of the economy. So it's not just that they are concentrated within the sector where they have a presence. They are actually looking concentrated on the entire national landscape. If you look around, there are 2 or 3 companies whose names I see in the newspapers all the time. And it worries me a lot. I think that there is no reason to believe that a company that is well run right now will be well run forever. Management can change. Management doesn't always remain in good shape when, in India, it's just the way we had dynastic rule in politics for a while. We also have family just changing hands from father to sons and so on in companies. That may or may not necessarily work out well. And when you have very large companies, this could be actually a very significant risk to the economy. So I think the key for India is to ensure that small businesses are vibrant, small businesses are globally competitive, and there is churn. Some of these small companies should first become the large middle-sized companies. Then they should have the capacity to become the large national level companies. And these should keep changing around. See, people look at United States and so, don't you have concentration? Don't you have a Google? Don't you have a Microsoft? Don't you have an Apple? And I like to tell them that when I was a summer intern at JP Morgan in 96, 97, Apple was about to go bankrupt. The big names that time was Yahoo. Where is Yahoo right now? It's actually not a very significant enterprise. There was no Google at that point of time. So even in the technology space, new names are coming at a fast pace. Netflix wasn't the name in India, in the United States 20 years back. This is a relatively new development. So while there is concentration, there is also a lot of new creation of enterprises, and they are quickly rising to the top. You need that kind of dynamism. You need that kind of market-friendly approach rather than a business environment that's just friendly to the current incumbents in the sector.
Right. We've got just about 6 minutes left, Dr. Acharya.
Yes, yes.
I'll just ask you 2 quick questions. Do you think we've run out of growth ideas?
Of which ideas?
Growth ideas. Do you think the think tank of India has run out of growth?
No, I think we have not run out of growth ideas. I think we don't have the political will at times to make it happen. I think, of course, I focus more on the fiscal and the financial side of things. But, I've been mentioning so many ideas on structural reforms for the fiscal side, structural reforms for the financial sector. I think clearly in infrastructure, education, maybe even in health, there are some fundamental structural reforms that are possible. I think there is no shortage of ideas. If you look at it, honestly speaking, we have had big reforms in 91. Then we had a big set of divestment reforms in 98 to 2003. We've had some big things like insolvency and bankruptcy code, for example, in 2016, flexible inflation targeting framework started in 2013-14, but implemented in law in 2016. I think these are like big structural changes, but we haven't done that much. So I think I would really hesitate to say we don't have ideas. I think we have ideas. What we need is the politics and the economics to align well now.
My final question to you would be, do you think India will ever have its own Paul Walker, or that's a pipe dream that we shouldn't really be looking at?
No, I think it's entirely possible. I think we've had several central bank governors who have actually stood up for the long-term sustainable growth of the economy. By sustainable growth, I mean not just growth, which is through short-term measures, not playing a T20, but playing a test match, as I like to call it, while securing financial and macroeconomic stability at the same time. I think it goes a little bit in cycles. I think we've had some governors who have been sort of more pragmatic, some governors who have been more sticklers for this financial stability and sustainable growth. I think we can do more on financial stability for sure. I think we are not doing enough. We still have an approach of kicking the can down the road, and we keep justifying it. What I don't like is that the narrative in India is very friendly towards being short-term oriented. In fact, most of the people, if I could be very frank, people used to be sarcastic with me, even within the central bank, saying, oh, your academic thinking is great. What they were telling me is that you are not a very practical person who cuts daily compromises on things. And you need the right balance. Sometimes it's important to resurrect growth in the midst of a situation like COVID. But was 2017, 18, 19 really a year in which we could have tossed financial stability aside? No, I think we were not growing at our highest levels of growth, but we were not in a crisis either. And so in India, there is too much acceptance of being practical, doing jugards, doing short-term measures for a little bit of 0.5%, 1% growth in 1 year. That's not the way a nation becomes great. A nation becomes great when it secures financial stability, macroeconomic stability, structural reforms for 10, 20, 30 years, and then delivers 7, 8% growth. Look at our population, look at our per capita GDP growth, look at the number of people we still need to eradicate out of poverty. This cannot happen with a 0.5% growth in 1 year. That's just really being greedy in the short run, rather than having a focus on what the children and the youth of India need for 10, 20, 30 years down the line.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Acharya. Thank you very much.
So I guess I didn't answer your question. I think I'm hoping that there is a Paul Walker moment for financial stability in India soon. I'm really looking for this person. I'm really looking for, and let me be very clear here. A deputy governor cannot be the Paul Walker. It has to be a governor who has to be the Paul Walker.
Yes, absolutely. Without a doubt. No, absolutely. Without a doubt, of course. I mean, that goes without saying. No, I mean, look, just to take one more minute, I asked that question simply because, sometimes in politics, templates get set and, the political parties learn from each other. They may look stupid, they aren't. They learn from each other and they can, they also do their own cost-benefit analysis to see what works better for them for their own self-interest. And unfortunately, sometimes bad examples can be very contagious. So I was just worried if we have a situation like this where bad examples become contagious, and then we have a situation where nobody ever has the courage to come forward and look at it. You mentioned things about the tendency to just kick the can down the road. I mean, that's pretty much what happens in the PSU bank leadership level as well. I mean, they're only looking at their own tenure, right? I mean, you have a CEO or an MD who come in for about 2 years or 3 years at best, as opposed to a corporate bank, private sector who will be there for 15 years, 20 years. So there is he's only interested in seeing his tenure through without a controversy, and then he's fine retiring and taking something else.
No, absolutely. This is always a risk in politics, which is that very often the voting is based on being better than the previous government that you had. And so I think when certain bad economics takes place over a period of time, that sets a very low bar over which the next governments that you elect have to perform. And in fact, that becomes the narrative that, look at them, they did so badly. We've done a little bit better than when they were. But, I think
also, sorry, and I guess it's also because Indian politicians love visible symbols of things they can sell. That's why the overemphasis on showing bridge bana diya hai and road bana diya, because those are things you can actually sell to an electorate. I mean,
and that's true everywhere. It's true in all parts of the world. I think what we are missing a little bit, in my view, is that our institutions are not that strong, especially in the financial sector. I push very strongly for bigger separation from the government and central banking, for greater ownership neutrality of bank regulation so that the regulator can deal with public sector bank problems as effectively and promptly as they can in the private sector banking. And I think we need more open public debate and voice. I think the central bank should feel comfortable speaking truth to power. It should feel comfortable saying no at times. And it should be granted that operational autonomy in the letter of the law so that you can secure long-term stability and not be cutting these short-term compromises all the time. Absolutely.
Right. I think we've reached the end of our time. We were given 1 hour. It's exactly 1 hour. So thank you so much, Dr. Acharya. I know you've been very busy. You're also in the middle of an election, so I'm sure you would be looking at the outcome there as well, purely as an observer, if not anything else. So thank you very much. Thank you for your words, and I'm sure everyone who heard you would have understood a lot about how India works and how Indian economy works, and the fact that there is not really a time to despair. Maybe we need to do a little better, but surely the glass isn't just half full. It possibly half empty is possibly half full as well. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Acharya.
Thank you for the opportunity and the very incisive questions, Vinay, and thank you to all the students for attending and organizing this. All the very best to you for your careers, to your families and loved ones in these challenging times, and keep up the voice, keep debating, keep looking for better solutions. And I agree with Vinay that, you can always get very cynical. Believe me, I'm not cynical after my term. After my book and after all the failed attempts to try and restore the health of public sector banks, I think it can still happen. You just have to keep at it. It takes sometimes time to do the right things, and one has to keep at it for a while. So.
Right. Thank you everyone, and as well. And I also wanted to wish all of you the very best. Thank you.
Sir, I would like to thank both of you for such an insightful session, and thank you so much for your time. As a token of our appreciation, a small contribution has been made in your names to Save Trees, an organization that works on tree plantation in India. Agroforestry saplings have been planted in your name and has made a difference to the life of a farmer in Karnataka. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. That's absolutely
excellent initiative. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you. Bye-bye. All the best, guys.